Waco friends, welcome to my channel. Today I am doing a Halloween inspired tutorial. This tutorial is going to have a lot of different textures that I'm going to create. The first thing that I did was cut out the raven using contact adhesive paper and applied it to my watercolor paper so that he is masked out. You could also use masking fluid if you don't have contact adhesive paper. And my first layer, I wanted a very fuzzy, light layer. So I am working wet on wet watercolor technique for my first layer. And I'm only using two colors for this painting, sepia and neutral tint. So taking the sepia, I am just randomly adding, kind of almost like just cross-hatching the colors in there, very, very loosely. Here, I'm flicking water on it so that I will have even more lighter spots. My second layer, I am working wet on dry, and I am loosely painting in a shape of a tree with the main branches only at this time. I'm keeping it nice and light so that you can see through the layers. It kind of has this cool look. If you guys are getting value out of this video and you like my artwork, please think about subscribing and hitting the notification button so that you don't miss any of the videos. I post every Tuesday. And my thought, because in the reference photo this is a very, has a lot of branches. The branches are just wild. So then I thought of using the watercolor plastic wrap technique. So this is my third layer on the background, and basically I am putting another layer of the sepia, painting it on and sticking the plastic wrap over it. And I keep playing with the plastic wrap until I can see all kinds of really neat organic lines that the paper makes, the plastic wrap I mean, makes this cool pattern. And I have noticed there's areas where the paint didn't go. I am lifting the plastic wrap and getting at those areas. So once you have the paper the way you want it, you just leave it dry. So as you can see, it creates this really cool background texture. And to enhance this texture, I am using just a very light wash again of the sepia and putting in some crazy crooked branches all over the place. I wanted a kind of like a Tim Burton feel to this background. I just love his art. He's just amazing. His sets and the things that he creates for movies is just very, very cool and inspiring to me. So I am taking my time with this background. Even though it's really light, I wanted the details of the branches in there. So now, taking off the contact paper, I'm wetting down my bird. So we're going to work that first layer of him wet on wet using sepia. Kind of like it's a very light wash of this over the whole thing to kind of tie in those colors from the background into the foreground. So right from the beginning, I'm always painting in the direction that the feathers go or the beak goes or what have you, whatever I'm painting. So I've got the whole layer on him. While it's wet, I'm going to go back in with some darker browns and really concentrating on my brush strokes and going in the direction that I see all these feathers. Okay, so remember, this is the ugly stage of watercolor. It doesn't look like much now, but each additional layer that we put on, it will start coming together. So now I'm adding in the neutral tint. And adding them in the same way, same brush strokes as I did with the brown. And where there's really light areas on the beak, I'm trying to preserve my whites. I'm leaving empty spaces there. So around his eye, there are a lot of really nice, organized kind of brush strokes in that spiral fashion that I'm working on. So obviously I had to speed up this painting tutorial for you, or we would be here for 3 hours and I wouldn't have an audience at the end of my video. So I'm trying to speed it up, but also tell you about all the most important points and how I went about each layer. So see, I haven't stopped yet. This is still my first layer. In my second layer, I am starting off with sepia for his eye. Because when you really look at the reference photo, it's like the reflection is almost like clouds on the upper part of his eye and land on the bottom. There's some shadows from the eye, and it was a lot of fun to paint. So my initial underpainting has to be of that light brown. So getting all his cool spiky feathers on his head and establishing those really dark tones just before the short feathers above his eye. There's almost like a stippling texture right around his eye. So I am adding in some of that stippling texture as I go around. His eye was a lot of fun to paint. adding in the underpainting on that beak and the light grays that's on the top of his beak. So I'm using a Princeton Black Velvet Series brush, number 6, and also a script liner brush. Getting in all the fine detailed hairs that's along his beak. Once the underpainting was there, adding in all those darker hairs with feathers, adding in the darker feathers with the script liner brush really makes it come to life. So as you can see, it takes a while to develop all these layers, and the fact that watercolor dries a lot lighter will require multiple layers to get your darks as dark as they need to be. And I typically never use a hairdryer to dry my paintings. I do find that hastening the drying process will dull your colors a little bit, and plus it also affects the strokes that you've painted. It could blur them out more. So I do a layer, walk away, get something else done, come back. It's kind of a neat progression of your day, painting in that way. So I wet the eyeball and I'm dropping in the neutral tint, trying to get that land mass as well as that clouds in the sky. That's the reflection. That's how I view it, because I kind of really zoomed in to see what was going on in that eyeball, so it's pretty neat. Yeah, I'm adding in more brown because the spiky parts on his hair are a brownish color. Okay, so I'm darkening up that bottom beak. It's a lot darker than the top one. There's still a lot of work to do on the beak because it's very flat. I don't really have any dimension to it yet. So adding in more colors. Starting the eye work on this next layer. It needs to be a lot darker. So now that I've circled that whole eye with the neutral tint, I'm extending the color out to include all the other areas of that reflection in his eye that needs to be darker. Also darkening up those feathers. Like I said, everything dries lighter. So you're basically just reworking each layer in the same manner adding more detail as you go along. When you put layer upon layer, it becomes almost like a three-dimensional effect. Like you notice that eye really looks three-dimensional in comparison to, you know, the first layer that we put down. Almost like a dry brushing effect on the top of his beak with all these fine hairs. Adding in some more sepia to his beak, and all I do is take some water and get it to be a lot lighter. While it's wet, I'm dropping in some darker brown, so I get a very gradual three-dimensional look. Okay, adding in sepia, and because it's wet, it's just spreading, very fuzzy. And the beak is really starting to take shape now. So I find it so much easier to paint towards myself. So I end up moving things around a lot. So these kind of paintings, they're obviously a lot more work. They take a lot more time. But I have to say, I do love paintings that are very realistic, and I find these type of paintings very rewarding. So I'm going through and darkening up the darkest parts of his feathers. Well, with each layer we do, it builds up a more three-dimensional look. Going back to that eye, adding in a darker layer using my neutral tint. Now I'm lifting up the eyelid, getting back that ring around his eye. Adding in the lines that are around his skin. I have a very small, I think it's a size 0 or 1 brush that I'm using working on his eye, and those tiny feathers around his eye. All right, so I thought I was done here, and taking a look at the final work in that bottom right-hand corner, I thought it was like all efforty, and so I didn't like it at all. So to soften that area, I wet it, and I'm going in with some neutral tint, and I am fixing the shadows in those feathers. So it's not so, I don't know, I just felt that it just didn't really match the other stuff. Also picking up some highlights by lifting on his beak. And these final little touches, I think, made a huge difference. You see, in that bottom corner now, it looks a lot more cohesive. So that's it, folks. Thank you for watching today. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you next week.